welcome to this very last session that obviously, not just because it is the very last session, but also because the people involved, is going to be a little bit different. We've kind of came across this amazing thing that Inyaki's made. And the plan is that Inyaki is going to say a little bit about how he came up to think of making this and the process behind it. But the idea is that we're not just here to look at beautiful artwork. We are here to think about the underlying concepts and how are we yet again trying to reconfigure those concepts to work under the present circumstances. The whole week was about reflections, and so this is the kind of the ultimate reflection is what we're taking forward and what do we think our own personal academic futures and maybe collective ones will make of these concepts and ideas that we are looking at right now. So that's why you've got work to do. That's why you've got pencils and pens, because after Inyaki's introduction, you'll be invited to draw, make, annotate, whatever, and in any way that you'd like to think of as to what you would like to see a future event like this reflect back on. But before we do that, as I say, Inyaki, and then just so as you do those, so it's not going to be just quiet work independently, Rhodri and I are going to just have a conversation about trends in concepts and how we build on each other's work, or do we build on each other's work? Do we not? A little bit about bibliometrics, a little bit about meta science, whatever that means, etc. So first of all, though, however, Inyaki to introduce his amazing work.
Thank you. Well, this all started because we had a really bad time finding a space, the PhD students. But we managed at some point to grab a basement in Chisholm House. And then we got the basement, but it was, a very sad basement. And we had some discussions of, we should bring some posters to a plant, I don't know, something like that. And I thought, yeah, we should definitely do that. I'm going to go and find online some STS posters. That's silly and some whatnot. But as you can imagine, there were none. Yeah, which was very likely to happen. So I decided to do my own, and then that turned into years of whenever I'm very desperate and very tired and trying to procrastinate, then I'll do a poster of a concept I like, of some fundamental idea that has shaped my thinking in the field. But it's also sparked some interesting conversations because every time I do a poster, I find that we have a lot of visiting students or other PhDs, and they always ask me like, "Oh, what is this?" So this sense of it came with my sense of we're not reading actually the classics anymore, or what I thought were the classics, the fundamental things. So we also then did a reading group to read the classics, and then we were like jokingly saying, we do the reading group so we can understand the posters. And I think, of course, it's not to understand the posters, but it is in a sense to understand the foundations of this thing that we are trying to build. So yeah, these are the story of the posters. I do them, as I said, when I'm bored, and the only rule I follow, there are two rules really. One is I have to like the concept and the idea, because otherwise it's mean-spirited. And I've came across some ideas of mean-spirited stuff, but then I don't do them, because that's not what I'm trying to do. So if you are seeing something here, it's a concept and an author I really appreciate and has been a contribution to my own thinking. And the other rule is I try to make them really silly and as self-explanatory as possible. Yeah, those are the two. Maylene, yes, question on the back.
Can you say a bit more about how posters also create controversies?
Oh.
And maybe misunderstandings, negative reactions?
Yeah, well, that was a funny story. So we started with the posters, and then the poster got constantly removed from the walls, and some were actually stolen or lost, and one was censored, but it wasn't mine. It was like a Sela fucking V. That was the poster, and it got censored, absolutely. I also had some other versions of some of these posters that were a bit more naughty. Those got censored as well. So I made PG versions. Yeah, so if you want to get the really adult stuff, then you have to, yeah, I'll send it to you. Yes, those are in the dark web. These are the PG versions. Yes, good point. Okay, I'm not sure, but I would invite you, if you have not yet, to walk around, uh, try to understand this madness, and then if you can, then do your own. Is that the...
Yes. Not just do your own. I mean, you can do one on existing stuff that you've already done. Um, in the same spirit that Iñaki has been doing. But you can also do the point of this session was also a little bit about the future. So you could also do a futuristic one, in which either a future Iñaki would be reflecting on your personal work and how you'd like to be represented in a cheeky way in the future and the concept you'd like to be known for. Or indeed another piece of work that maybe you don't directly associate with, but you feel it's a critical contribution that STS is making today or should be making today. That again you'd want future PhD students and future colleagues to kind of reflect on and engage with. And again, it is the last session of the last day, so we thought, make it as fun as possible. You can have a look around. As we said, thank you so much, Iñaki. It's just this was kind of quick introduction, and I really, I mean, absolutely fantastic work. We also now have a high quality reproductions of the posters, and I would like to propose that they graduate from the basement and go into the STIS coffee room and occupy a central place in the STIS coffee room, because I think when I saw them first, I thought, well, if this isn't the best representation of our intellectual community in Edinburgh, then I don't know what it is, right? That's a conversation to be had with the States or somebody to put the board up or something. Anyways, so you can have a look around if you like. You can also just, if you already have an idea, start drawing, doodling, whatever. If you're not too careful, we might post your posters alongside these in the coffee room, so just and we'll have hopefully some time at the end if anybody would like to share what you've drawn with the rest of the group to also share that. But in the meantime, I think that one of the things that Iñaki kind of very clearly mentioned, and it's something that actually I've been reflecting on a lot in the past year, where I've started to properly have PhD students, is the kind of how do we ensure that that we understand the reconfigurational nature of scholarship, of the fact that we are building on existing conceptual work. I know some of you have heard my anecdote from, well, most of you have heard my anecdote from last year's East conference, where I get incredibly frustrated because in a session I ran, a number of speakers fail to engage, even though they were speaking about pretty much the same concept, they failed to engage with the critical work in the field. And I feel that's and the fact that, you mentioned like, oh yeah, after the posters were done, we're like, we should really read this stuff, right? Is that kind of thing, one of the ultimate points of reflection really is how much time for reflection do we really have? How much do we look at other people's work? What do bibliometric trends, and this is why I dragged Rhodri into this, because what do bibliometric trends actually mean? Is citation really about engagement with those concepts, or is it just some kind of a ritual we perform to get published and to get, you've got those things in there? To what extent there's patterns there that actually demonstrate one or the other? So yeah, you can move around. So the plan is Rhodri and I are going to probably try and do about 15 minutes or so of kind of a chat. In the meantime, you can draw, etc. And then once that's done, you can share posters of your own if you like. Okay. do you want to just say a little bit about your take on this madness as Iñaki clearly introduced the session?
Yeah, okay, super. So yeah, I'm Rhodri, and so for last year's ISSTI, I mapped out the publications in 4 STS journals and looked at how they referenced other literature, and looked at patterns of how that literature's developed over time. And through that, I think, I don't know what I was expecting to find, but a few things kind of became very apparent to me as I was doing it. So the first was that the 4 society journals, well, at least 3 society journals, are perhaps poor representations of the STS as it's practiced in the department. Lots of people in the department don't actually publish in those journals anymore. As I started to look into the trends, what you see is a kind of slow dispersion of the field as it goes from quite a kind of tight core around specific topic areas, such as the sociology of science, sociology of scientific knowledge, sociology of technology. And over time, especially over the last kind of 10, 15 years, what you're seeing is a kind of spread out into specialist thematic areas. So biology, environmental science, STS. And one of the questions that we had is there a kind of hollowing out in some ways of a core of STS? And you've got a lot on the periphery and not much that binds us together maybe as much as we once did as a community. The other thing that kind of struck me was that the number of journals that we are publishing across is massive, and that it's increasing. And so our literature is also increasingly dispersed across lots of different areas. So it's not that we're necessarily publishing lots, but it's actually quite difficult to know where it's being published. And as a result of that, I think if you look at the citation distributions to the articles in those journals, you're primarily getting citations to the old classic works still. New things aren't breaking through as much as they once did. So Latour's Science in Action, the year after it was published, became the most cited book across the journals I looked at, and it has been the most cited item every year since. Now, what that says, it makes me a little bit worried. And so I think that looking at those trends, and I'm happy to send over of my work to anybody, did make me think about what the future is for our field and what it is we want to be doing. My own research looks at the kind of how scientific fields develop over time, and looking around our field and comparing it to the other fields that I've been studying, I do wonder whether we could be maybe doing a few things differently. So I'll leave that to you to think about. So for you, the posters are about concepts, but I suppose my interest is in the kind of social community that is STIS. And what do we want that to look like in 10, 15 years? Because I think we've moved away from kind of small groups of individuals that are to something that's going to have to be quite different. I'll pass it over to you.
Cool. I think the other thing that we kind of mentioned a little bit, and it's something that I think would be interesting to begin to reflect and maybe to draw into those sort of poster, is the sort of the idea of kind of relevance, right? I mean, there's a lot of stuff in here that we can identify has started at least sort of trends in STS, but from Iñaki's interpretation, it's also very clear it has a kind of a really strong social relevance, right? I mean, there's maybe a few that are more historiographical, for the lack of a better word, right? So they're a little bit more about, they're a little bit less about contemporary issues and more about, but even those, there are quite clear and obvious implications for how they would apply to a whole number. And this is I think the interesting thing, right? To a whole number of scenarios, contexts, and types of studies, right? And I think one of the things that I'm starting to get a bit concerned about is in this sort of reconfigurational way, right? Which is like, okay, now it's loosely, both Rhodri and I have not been in our job for long enough to say that we've made a massive contribution to the field. So it's now is our turn, right, to reconfigure, to come up with something, to, you know, and if you want to be considerate to the intellectual legacy that's represented in this room, but also on the other hand, you know, there is the idea of sort of novelty that is demanded, that is by many ways is also phenomenologically required by the fact that, you know, times have changed, things need to be reinterpreted. The question is, you know, does that happen as a sort of niche within existing stuff, or is it even still possible to kind of, you know, it's a little bit of reflection on what you just said, right? Is it even still possible to come up with something as fundamental as you know, we've just celebrated social construction, social shaping of technology yesterday, or Scott specifically as a theory maybe, or you know, we've been talking about Mark 1, 2, and 3. We can add those sort of contemporary interpretation, but there seems to be there's a Mark 0, there's a Mark X, right? It's just, you know, so contemporary. So to what extent are we combining theoretical work, you know, existing concepts together to making something new, or reconfiguring them? And to what extent are we just riffing off the same tune in more specific ways? Which is, I think your research implies that that's more what's happening. And when we were preparing, well, we were chatting about this session, we also both remembered Nikki Vermeulen's inaugural lecture, in which she actually talked about interdisciplinarity and collaboration, in which she talked about the fact that, you know, this sort of model, the donut model with the hollow core, right? Which is this sort of the fact that we're actually, you know, we're taking them in all possible directions, but we're not really developing that kind of core stuff. So to what degree would I mean, I'd also, I mean, we can comment maybe from, again, more analytical point of view, but to what degree I was looking at and reflecting at what I did so far, not much, but, you know, what I did do so far. And I can kind of claim a degree of, you know, novel application of some of the STS stuff to a particular case study. Yeah, I can think I tick that box. I can claim maybe a small contribution in trying to systematize some aspects of STS and STS associated thinking. It's the only systematic literature review I ever did, but it actually contributed. And we also talked about nobody, you know, systematic literature reviews are kind of out of fashion, and you do one as part of your PhD, and then you basically never do it one again. And that's kind of maybe a little part of the problem, because the one that I did do kind of contributed to something that I would consider a small incremental theoretical contribution I've made, which is about systematizing this stuff around innovation intermediaries. Anyways, so there's that, and then you know, following on from that, I think I'd say that now I'm playing with ideas of effectively, you know, STS translation in, let's say, large professional domains, which it feels like, well, there's a little bit, there is a kind of a, you know, down the rainbow, I can draw a poster of my own that would maybe reflect some of the stuff that I'm saying, right? So maybe also just from Rhodri's point of view and looking at the data, what do you think is one of, do any of these actually cut the mustard in terms of how the field is being formed?
To evaluate your contributions to it? No, I'm not going to.
Just mine, specifically.
No, I mean, I think if you look at what creates I mean, I think if you to make an impact, you need to create a kind of tight-knit community around that. And in many ways, I mean, I think a lot of the time in other areas, those communities form around new methods and new tools. And I think the big innovative leaps will come when new methods come into STIS, because I think it will be the adoption of new methods that advances new theories, because you need different theories when you start using different tools. So I think, but that's fine. Maybe we don't need to be radically new. So maybe there's a lot to be said of kind of incremental growth. But yeah, maybe we shouldn't compare ourselves to when things were kind of radically new. Maybe that's not the time for these. But I mean, I think just to stress that I think one thing that I think we need to think about as a field is how do we keep a kind of strong, coherent community together? Because I mean, I think in the end, the quality of work that happens is about having people who are interested in the work that is being produced, and that through their kind of collective scrutiny, make that work good. So I don't think individuals are excellent. I think you get excellent communities. I think it is more difficult maybe now to know who your community is and what the problems are in the field. And I think in some ways maybe it's more difficult for us to get hard in the community because there isn't an understanding, at least it's not easy to know what the understanding of what are the shared problems we're working on. So when a contribution comes along, it's not clear what it's actually doing. And so I think there needs to be a little bit more work done on thinking about what are we trying to do as a field, what are the kind of methods and their strengths and weaknesses, and are our conceptual tools still working for what we want them to do and for the purposes that who's the field for, what are we trying to do?
Yeah, no, and I think that this thing about tools is really kind of interesting because I, again, actually been working lots with designers and actually trying to STSify design tools as both methods of analytical methods, but also methods of sort of intervention within the field. And it's interesting because they kind of work both ways, and it's also interesting because they are. You're right in a sense. That's exactly the sort of theory that's maybe missing in STS. We had to then resort to effectively things like critical art and critical art theory, critical future studies. Things that are STS adjacent and they speak to a lot of STS concerns, but they're not. They also miss an awful lot of what's in this posters, what's in the kind of the core reading list of STS. And I think actually there's an interesting kind of consolidation question there. Is like so if we are seeing specifically, this is something I put in in the previous session, right? When you're seeing specifically fields that are either kind of appropriating STS domains and spaces, and or they're so adjacent that they feel useful. So how do we navigate those boundaries? How do we maybe try and kind of consolidate that? I mean, there's the obvious thing, which is, as STSers being very nomadic, I've made a lot of it from, peripatetic, whatever, right? You could go there and play with them, right? And you can bring STS into those fields, right? But how does the feedback work, right? And we talked a little bit about the fact that, one of the bottlenecks we recognize, for instance, is just the ability to publish in what is considered this relatively narrow STS literature, right? And ability to bring critical concepts back, because, if you're doing this work that's kind of interactional, it often has a very receptive community in the sectors or in the places you're engaging with, but they're not necessarily such a receptive community back in STS because everybody's having their own interactional stuff and they're just not that interested in yours, right? So I think, I know you looked a little bit at other journals and there's a recent project you've done that kind of looked at that, how that publishing works and what is the critical mass to make it work.
Yeah, so I've been really kind of inspired by work with some astrophysicists in helping them write a review on developments in kind of black hole astrophysics. As a community, it was quite shocking to, in some ways, made me change my opinion about what we might need to do in scientific publishing. So this is a community that is kind of collected around maybe 3 or 4 core journals. Everyone in the field knows that they're the core journals. And the acceptance rate in their biggest journal, APJ, I think it's APJ, is about 90%. So almost they accept most of the things that are submitted, and things are published within 3 to 6 months. And it means that the field can move quickly and that debates can happen. If you look at our own journals, it's difficult to get published, and it can take a ridiculously long time to publish. If you're waiting 18 months to publish a paper, what kind of debate can you actually have in the literature? I don't think you can have a debate. So I think our journals need to probably expand. The exact opposite of, in part, if you slow down science to the point, or academic discussion, that you have to wait a year and a half, 2 years to actually respond, you can't have a discussion. And so I think that's
Yeah, Robin. Just one thing.
We're trying to publish the stuff we're doing on digital health in social science STS journals and in health technology journals. And by the time you get your response back from the reviewer from the STS journal, you've forgotten ever writing the bloody paper. Yeah, and it's kind of so painful. It's not only low success rate, massive amounts of change required, and that's a very low and slow and difficult learning process. Whereas if you put something into a health technology magazine, you'll get the 3 months is long. You know, it could be 3 weeks before you get the feedback from the referee, and you can go through a couple of cycles and have something go from writing to publication in a matter of months. So it's a real, I mean, and that's why I find myself increasingly publishing in those kind of specialist trade journals rather than the core STS journals. And I think it's a bit of a problem because the trouble is it's attractive to do that. It's a much more pleasant game. It's a very painful game trying to social studies of science. And yet, then we don't know if we don't write in social studies of science or something. There's only a small number of journals that we're all referring to. But I mean, that also relates to something else. I mean, Stuart Ross and I, we sweat our cats out to produce a glossary of technology studies terms in 2002. Yeah, and because we noticed that each new writer, instead of, as in other disciplines, validating concepts and methodologies and using them as an established terminology, in our field, we each tend to innovate our new methodology and our new terminology. And I think that's a kind of systemic weakness of our field, and I don't think it's an accident. I think it's actually because of how we relate to knowledge. We don't want to feel trapped by other people's concepts, so we develop neologisms for everything. But it has consequences on the way we do scholarship. And the other one is, perhaps, that we don't do enough about methodology. We've just had comments about reflections. There wasn't a single, well, maybe there may have been something methodology, but it wasn't a core concept. So anyhow, it's a kind of, we may need to
Wasn't everyone, yeah.
do stuff.
But I mean, I think you see this in the data as well, that there's a surprisingly few methodological references that have become like widely shared. You know, I think there's a few classic works on ethnography, but if you look at the
I remember this was one of the first things that Robin ever told me, which was that, you know, the most cited social science thing is Yin's case studies, right?
I'm sure
It's just that, you know, everybody cites case studies, right? And so it's like 12,000 a year. Yin case studies, right? It's like,
Who
it's
is it? Does Yin exist?
nobody knows. It's like this lore.
We could take over and say, I am Yin.
Yeah, we're all Yin. But this is the sort of thing, yes. Samsa first and then Jamie. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. I fully share your. I tried to kind of keep this for nest yesterday slightly, and I could see in the audience that there were cautious nodding, and then there were sort of like, you shouldn't be kicking this kind of reactions. I think STS is kind of trapped onto an interesting mode. I mean, if you look at the sort of start of the sort of proliferation of STS in 80s, it's largely kind of just did away with the Mertonian sort of sociology of science and a lot of the diffusion of innovation. There's this sort of wholesale denial that, okay, the stuff that was there before, we don't want to know about it, we kickstart something new. And this was really successful move at the time. But that's such a long time ago, and it's still kind of bothering us. So somehow STS journals don't expect rounded sort of conceptual review and rounded sort of uptake of the concepts that are being used. It's enough to pick one of these posters and put that in and sort of start there, and then we get this endless repetition and sort of the accumulation of good work that I tried to say yesterday in between. There is lots of it in STS. It just gets unacknowledged, and this is really disheartening for sort of younger generations of researchers. So I'm here including myself in those younger generations of researchers as well. So I think there is something that ought to be done about this. The other thing that we discussed yesterday with Robin in the pub is that indeed this sort of there's a legacy of quite old school review practices in soil sciences, but STS maybe in particular, that we have this sort of very hands-on editorial sort of practices. We share this with business. Business schools are increasingly moving towards this, that you have endless rounds of review in the top journals, and your papers might not get better. They get kind of squeezed into sort of a preferred way that a given journal wants their papers. It's not making the papers better necessarily. So that's also something that I'm sort of concerned that, you know, the point of the peer review and the point of a journal is to say whether something is within the scope of a journal and whether it passes the quality criteria. If it does that, it's not really reviewers or even editors' job to meddle with the paper that much, and let alone spend 3 years doing this. And this is what SSS, Science Culture, sometimes Science Technology Human Values, this is very much what they do. And I find that really problematic, and it's really also pushing me to consider twice whether I want to publish in STS journals. Most of the time I don't, even though I very much identify myself as an STS scholar. So I think there's some sort of a weird, so I fully...
Yeah, no, Rhodri and I were just, you know, just reflecting on our own, right? Neither of us have, I mean, I published in East Review, but that's not really a journal, right? But it has light touch editorial peer review. But like, you know, neither of us have ever published in any really STS journals, right?
No. So I mean, I published in quantitative science studies in part just because it was getting off the ground at the time. But no, I've not. Yeah. So.
Partially because of that, right? Because you kind of know and you self-select, and then also you make choices, and especially when you're working closely with fields that you want to be part, that you want to really engage with, and you start to sort of judge. And I think this is I think the problematic judgment that kind of, again, to bring it back to this kind of idea about concepts and reconfigurations, right? This is a problematic judgment from the point of the fact that if your field is not aware of what you're doing, then how can it engage with that work? But we've kind of made the judgment that actually it's more important that the subject matter field know about the work, because they can respond to it in a very practical way that is sort of shaping the science and technology that we study, rather than shaping the study of the science and technology, right? Which is kind of, yeah, challenging.
But I mean, I definitely agree with everything you said, but I think it's a worrying place for a field to be in if people are questioning whether they want to publish in the main journal, and whether that's actually acting as a kind of center force for the field anymore. Is it really where STS is being? Is SSS really the kind of flagship journal for the field anymore? In some ways, because is it really doing what we want it to do, which is showing the direction of travel of the field? I think my dissatisfaction with it is probably not.
Jamie and then Iñaki.
Yeah, I want to make a comment as an editor of a journal. It's on the periphery of STS, technology analysis, strategic management. It used to be more central to STS. I'd welcome more STS input. In terms of the time to review as an internal problem, I try to give a response whether it's within scope, within a week I receive the paper. And I try to encourage my associate editors to look at the quality within a couple of weeks. But if it goes to review, we are entirely dependent on the reviewers. And the question I would ask here is this not a problem incurred by ourselves because we are the reviewers? And in these other fields, maybe the reviewers are more on the ball and respond far quicker. That's one point. The other point is, I don't think that people read journals anymore. They do Google searches and pick out papers that are relevant. So it's almost immaterial where you publish. From a reader's point of view, it's only material where you publish from a writer's point of view. And this, I would say, I would finger the metrication, what was referred to a couple of days ago as the projectification of academic art. That people feel obliged to go for a top journal in their field in order to get recognition. And I wonder if the Google search and the location of where you publish are not at odds with one another, and how we cope with that. Because I think it is damaging the field. I think it's not helping early career researchers get published. I don't think it's helping anything, basically, but we are caught up in this American idea of publish and perish. And then rather than people coming up with something that they feel is worthwhile, is worth publishing, they now feel they have to go through rounds of review to get something to fit with the journal. That doesn't necessarily mean for good quality papers. I don't know what the solution is, but sometimes I think, as an editor, that having a journal is almost, with the review process, double-blind review process, is supposed to be the really tough level, is a waste of time. It would be far better having open review, open publication. People publish stuff, and then it lives or dies according to whether people cite it or use it, or think it's worthwhile. As evident, we found these ideas worthwhile. That's probably far more valuable than just having a paper in a four-star journal.
I mean, I definitely agree. I think it has come back to kind of thinking about the community, which is, I think finding reviewers is getting harder. So I'm an editor on a journal, and you can sometimes send the same paper out to 40 people before anybody accepts to review it, and it seems to be in their area. As I say, the astrophysicists don't seem to have this problem. So because there's a kind of a journal that they see as of their community, they all review for it as well. So they publish in it and review for it, and it's kind of shared by the community. Whereas, I don't feel like I've got a journal that does that.
But they also have an open, I forget what it's called now, but an open series.
Archives. But that's one, the pre-publication, so repositories, and then go to journals. That's one way. The other thing that many fields have done is especially in chemistry and human computer interaction, that you have really large volumes. So the volume of the journals really reflect the volume of the field. Whereas in precise technology studies, we have 5,000 delegates these days. It's no longer 300. But if you look at the number of journals is almost exactly the same as it used to be. So we have tenfolded the number of people who are doing STS of one or other flank, but we haven't, the volumes have maybe
Incrementally increased.
Maybe twofold in terms of how much space there is in these terms. And that is creating the problem. Of course, that's in a sense nice for the leading journals to hold this exceedingly exclusive club, which they might enjoy that status, maybe, and do knowledge politics on that basis. But it's really problematic that for the field as a whole. So that's also something. And then we have this thing that especially underserved these days is the innovation studies, technology studies nexus. So we have technology analysis and strategic management with the sympathetic editor. We used to have research policy with first Michel Calon and then Stefan Kuhlmann there. But now both have stepped down, and there is nobody from STS in research policy anymore. So that nexus is really underserved, and STS journals don't. The engagement with innovation studies rather oftentimes, at least I feel, a bit of a minus rather than a sort of positive. So
Techno-innovation is still trying to do stuff. Yeah.
Technovation.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that it has any kind of STS. So it was very mainstream a couple of years back, and I crossed it out my list of relevant journals.
Yeah,
but
they
have shifted back.
A little bit, yeah. I'd say that there's a few things that are coming. They're coming back a little bit, partially because of the vacuum, especially research policy. Research policy has just kind of exited the STS route pretty much, right? And that's felt, and then people look for other things, and actually tech innovation has picked up some of the stuff. But you're right in terms of technology studies are just the space is constricted, and especially the conversation between technology studies and innovation studies is almost non-existent now. Anyways, this kind of went really very far into kind of the more technical stuff around publications, etc. But we hope that this reflection, again, as yet another in the series of reflections we had this week, is helpful. I don't think we've come up with any kind of really strong solutions or strategies, but I think we had some really good suggestions around publishing more things, like open publishing stuff and open reviewing stuff, maybe. I mean, in the end, these journals are governed by the community in a sense. So I'm sure that there will be more editors taken on board, etc. So, you know, we could go there and change things. Yes?
On that note, so we have Jamie here, but also if your work relates to design, then there is very soon, as in a matter of 3 weeks, there's a new Design Research Society journal called Designing, which is to become its flagship journal very quickly, and amongst the senior editors is yours truly. So, so in the nexus of sort of STS and design, you can be very interesting.
You want to pitch?
I mean, maybe I'm going to ask you as the co-director of ISSTI. I mean, is it? Sounds like there's kind of space for some kind of journal. Also, you know, you're talking about revenue models, and is there a space for a kind of ISSTI review journal? I mean, you've got Edinburgh University Press here.
Edinburgh. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, Edinburgh University. So the journal publishing is a relatively specialized thing. So to run a journal through, you know, there's 4 houses that run journals. You know, Taylor TNF, Sage, and a bunch of others. We are actually, I'm involved in setting up a journal as it happens, not a whole scale STS one, but an STS anthropology and sort of ethnography of technology type stuff around space in particular. So social studies about the space, the network is setting up a journal. And we have looked at all the options. And the reality of this is that basically the publishing houses, if you want to run into a publishing house, they want to see effectively a business case. And that business case, you know, on one hand you can say, well, you know, we've clearly identified the need for a different kind of journal, and you can probably get away with that. But the thing that we found particularly bizarre is that the publishing house basically, when we've made the pitch for this social studies about the space journal, they came almost like back with a counter pitch. Yeah, but change this, and this. Like literally they're starting to shape our academic community, and we were just really freaked out by it. They were like, oh no, but you should include this. And we're like, we don't like that. We don't feel that that's with the ethos of this network. So it's a kind of really strange conversations, but it'd be definitely something interesting to do. The alternative, which is actually what the thing that we've now been left with, is sort of open publishing, like not open review, but using existing platforms, so the OG Open Journal Platform system, OGS. Most universities, including Edinburgh, have a dedicated person that runs the platform for all journals, open these sort of journals that are hosted at the institution. I've got a number of projects that are going in direction. This shouldn't be a pre-announcement. It is something we're trying to do, which is to get the very well-known PICT working paper series that was published through the PICT program run by Robin and others in the 1990s, fully digitized and republished as a kind of a closed open journal. So they would sit on the platform. There would be new editions, but maybe there would be. You know, maybe there's a good example, or there's a good place to say, well, actually, there's already this existing body of scholarship, and we are now looking at specific field reviewing, the kind of type of studies that we can kind of add to continue that series, or to kind of create some kind of special editions, but not run a journal, because I don't think we have the infrastructure. The problem with that, however, is that you don't have the infrastructure, right? Then you have to do not just the peer review, which is a problem, but not the biggest problem. You have to do the copy editing and and all the mundane things, which whilst these platforms are quite automated, but they're kind of structured, and you have like a process that you can follow, they nonetheless require a lot of labor. And we already don't have enough time to write, review, edit, and now we'd also copy. So that's the challenge. So setting up journals is actually much. We found that it's much harder than we initially thought. And it was bizarre because we've had really positive interaction with this sort of large publishing houses. They're like, oh yeah, we'd love to hear your proposal. It seems like you've got a great thing and the field and it is critical mass. And then very quickly down the road, we're like, well, but we need a business case. And in order for us to this make sense, can you lump in all of this other stuff that we have hoovered from all over the places? And we're just like, well, no, that's not what the field does. Samsa, one last point.
Yeah, and if you're making profit with the big publishing houses, you never see it.
Oh yeah, there's no money coming back. Oh yeah, that's another thing I should mention. Is that interesting? There's a one, and then the week has been too long for me to remember from the top of my head. But there's one surveillance society, I think. They were a network, and they set up a journal, and they're running the journal through some kind of open access, open source platform, and they've created a charity. And they're doing everything in-house, lots of labor, but that means that actually they are taking in subscription money, and that actually funds that helps fund the conference. The conferences help fund the journal or something like that. So they're basically using the community to effectively crowdsource the money they need to actually run the scholarly publication. And because it's surveillance society, I don't know. I think unfortunately Ben isn't here. I think Ben has actually published with them. But the labor is there, right? And we've had the meeting with them when we were setting on, and they told us, they're like, yeah, I mean, you can do it. Their experience has been positive from an intellectual point of view. Of course, they're also making a point about surveillance society and what does, corporate ownership of journals actually do to scholarship and how they're able to be editorial and otherwise independent by not being part of that narrative. But they've also very clearly made the point that it's a huge undertaking, and it's very perilous to actually start it off. But yeah.